Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you so much for coming. We're so excited that you're here. My name is Jane Ellickson Coplan. I'm the president of the local chapter of the League of Women Voters. I appreciate you coming today. We are very excited to be here celebrating the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the 19th Amendment. This event is a collaboration of 4 local organizations: the League of Women Voters, the Macomb Women's Club, which is a chapter of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the Macomb Feminist Network, and the Western Illinois Museum. Before we get started with our speakers, I would like to make a few announcements. We appreciate everyone wearing a mask today, and we encourage you to continue to keep a physical distance from others. It's incredibly important that we all vote in November. Early voting at the courthouse starts on September 24th and continues through November 2nd. Absentee ballots can be ordered online now from the McDonough County Clerk's website, and they will be mailed out around September 24th. If you use an absentee ballot, you can mail it back through the Postal Service, or there will be a drop box on the east side of the courthouse where you can hand deliver your absentee ballot. And then, of course, the polling places in McDonough County will be open on November 3rd, so make a plan now about how you will cast your vote. If you are not registered to vote, or if you need to update your voter's registration, maybe update your address or something, there's a website that you can use to do that if you are a resident of Illinois. If you would like more information, the location of the website, we have some cards at the League of Women Voters table, so feel free to go over and get one. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to have a series of short talks about various aspects of the rights given to us by the 19th Amendment. After that, we're going to have a short parade around the park, when we'll end in front of the Facing the Storm statue, and we'll conclude there and have some pictures taken. I also want to mention that we will be live streaming tonight on Facebook starting at 7 p.m. That program will include 2 additional talks as well as the ones you will hear today. The Facebook page for that is titled 19th Amendment Celebration, Macomb, Illinois. As we begin our program of speakers now, we start by acknowledging a very important fact. The victory that we celebrate here today, the adoption of the 19th Amendment, was primarily a victory for white women. While it theoretically gave all women the right to vote, we know that black women were prohibited from voting in many areas of our country. We also acknowledge that within the women's suffrage movement, women of color were subjected to segregation and other racist practices by the white women in the movement. And we acknowledge that voter suppression practices today still disproportionately affect individuals of color. The women's suffrage movement was launched at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke these stirring words there. "We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love." Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Mary McClintock, Martha Coffin Wright, and Jane Hunt were the leaders of the Seneca Falls Convention. Susan B. Anthony joined the movement about 3 years later. It took 72 years and the work of thousands and thousands of women and some men to gain the constitutional right for women to vote. In the end, ratification came down to one single vote the vote from Harry Burns of the Tennessee General Assembly, who was reportedly persuaded by his mother, Phoebe Ensinger Byrne, to vote yes. So that shows you the power of a single vote. Today I want to speak briefly about two women of the early 20th century. The first one is Carrie Chapman Catt. Catt was about 40 years younger than Susan B. Anthony, and in 1900 she followed Anthony as the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Catt was a skilled political strategist involved in the suffrage movement starting in 1880. Her leadership was particularly instrumental in the last 5 years of the campaign. Catt devised what they called the Winning Plan, which carefully coordinated state suffrage with the national movement. And in 1920, she also founded the League of Women Voters with the intention of educating women on political issues, encouraging them to vote, and helping them to get registered to vote. While we admire her work in all those areas, we do also need to acknowledge that she used racist arguments in her attempt to gain the support of Southern leaders of the time. The League of Women's Voters National Organization has issued a statement regarding this matter, which can be found at the League's national webpage. I'm going to read a short portion of that to you now. The League was founded in 1920, just months before the ratification of the 19th Amendment by American suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt. Catt was a complicated character, a political operative, and by modern standards, yes, a racist. Her remarks are sometimes brushed over as signs of the times or a political strategy. But actions speak louder than words, and our organization was not welcoming to women of color through most of our existence. Today, we acknowledge this shortcoming and that we have more work to do. End quote. The other early 20th century woman that I want to talk about today is a woman named Ellen Cassia Kane Dowling. Ellen Kane Dowling was my grandmother, and she was a suffragette. Not a major figure by any means, but one of the many, many women like you and me, who campaigned in their own communities to win the right for women to vote. She did not envision women actually holding public office. What she and other women of her peer group really wanted was for women to have the political power to improve lives for the vulnerable members of society. This was the era of Jane Addams, of Carrie Nation, and other progressive women reformers, including Ida B. Wells, Florence Kelley, Charlotte Brown Hawkins, and Margaret Sanger. My grandmother cared about child labor laws, workplace protection, public health, and public education. On Tuesday, November 2nd, 1920, was the first national election where women voted. Ellen Dowling was an election judge that day. She was also an expectant mother. She was carrying my mother, who was born a few months later in 1921. For that reason, my mother used to like to say that she was present the first time that women voted. We all carry the legacy of our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, and all the women who walked before us. As I look around the park today, I am so inspired to see younger women and men who will continue to carry that legacy. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Brenda Allison, who is the president of the Macomb Women's Club.
Thank you, Jane. I would like to start by acknowledging I am the General Federation of Women's Club Macomb president, and we also have in our presence Teresa Sanford Shiplett, who is our state president, and she is here in the hat. Can you wave? So we're honored to have our Illinois state president here. And I'd also like to note that parts of my speech come from the late Jackie Pierce, who was a GFWC International President 2006-2008. So I wanted to acknowledge Jackie and all the history that she put together. It's the year 1913, a critical moment for the women's suffrage movement. After more than a decade of efforts to secure a federal amendment, a massive women's suffrage parade brought 10,000 women to Washington to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to demand the vote. But the attention of the suffrage parade would be of little value if we couldn't turn it into widespread support. Advocates of suffrage had long counted the millions of women active in the women's club movement as key to their effort. When Carrie Chapman Catt succeeded Susan B. Anthony as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, one of the first things she did was start a society plan to recruit leaders of women's clubs to the suffrage cause because she knew they were an important link in their communities. But votes for women remained controversial. It wasn't until a number of Western states granted suffrage that a suffrage parade got national attention. When influential socialites put their weight and money behind the cause, the federal amendment for women's suffrage gained real momentum. Official support of the suffrage by the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which we call GFWC, which was by far the largest and most vital women's organization in the country, representing over 1 million women, signaled that the suffrage movement had graduated from a one radical dream to a mainstream cause. Many important women have been associated with GFWC and had been long leaders in the suffrage movement. Frances Willard, head of the Women's Temperance Union, and Julia Ward Howe, the famous author of the Battle Hymn of Republic. But only a majority vote of the representative delegates at the Chicago 1914 GFWC convention would gain the movement the credibility it desperately needed. Pro-suffrage resolutions had been blocked from coming to the floor for the past two conferences, so the outcome was uncertain as the delegates headed to Chicago. Pro-suffrage, anti-suffrage, they were presented and the debate was heated. GFWC President Annie Pennybacher was personally in favor of suffrage, and I quote what President Pennybacher said, "The highest type of women must be interested in politics and all the vital questions of the day in order to fulfill her mission as wife and mother." In Chicago, delegates heard about the world progress of women, but it was still uncertain if a resolution in favor of suffrage would be brought to vote on the floor. Then the Illinois delegation took matters in its own hand and passed a resolution in favor of political equality for men and women. Pennsylvania, Indiana, New York, and other states quickly followed. President Pennybacher said that there will be a suffrage resolution presented tomorrow at our convention. On June 14, 1914, the GFWC approved a resolution stating, "The General Federation of Women's Clubs give the cause of political equality for men and women its moral support by recording its earnest belief in the principle of political equality regardless of sex." The GFWC's endorsement for suffrage for women was major news. It affirmed that suffrage had become a mainstream cause for middle-class women from every part of the country. But by 1917, scores of suffragists, including Alice Paul, were imprisoned at the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia for picketing the White House to demand the right to vote. when the iron-jawed angels, as they were called, were released from the workhouse after enduring months of disgusting conditions, the public outcry about their treatment made the possibility of a federal suffrage movement amendment a reality. The turning point to women's rights culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, and certified August 26, 1920, 100 years ago today. Women's suffrage may not have become a reality without the historic support of the General Federation of Women's Club. And we are still here today. We are in your communities. The Macomb Club has over 100 members. I'd also like to invite you to join in our parade after our speakers speak, and we will parade to the GFWC Macomb Women's Club statue facing the storm and patio that honors women that make a difference in other people's lives. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Tammie Lee Brown Edwards. She is a Macomb City Alderwoman, and I'm delighted that she has been able to come and speak with us today.
Today, I wear the yellow rose. In 1920, suffragists and anti-suffragists met in Nashville, Tennessee to lobby the state legislature for and against ratifying the 19th Amendment. Both sides wore rose-shaped pins to indicate which side of the battle they were on. Suffragists wore yellow roses and anti-suffragists wore red roses. Good afternoon, I'm Tammie Lee Brown Edwards. I greet you from the asterisk side of the 19th Amendment. Today I will tell you two stories, one that's my own and one that is not. Their story. Although black men had technically been able to get the vote with the 15th Amendment passage in 1870, they were disenfranchised, especially in the South. So the passage of the 19th Amendment was something that black women reasoned it would be their time and could not be denied. In 1913, in March, women walked to Washington down Pennsylvania Avenue. Women were on horseback, women walked, and many onlookers were on the parade side. Black suffragettes were relegated to the back of those processions. Observers said at that day, according to the Washington Post, an article in August, that they pushed their way ahead of the line and even tried to integrate the line. Those activists brought up the rear and mingled among the other delegates. Those women belonged to the sorority of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, founded in 1913, just some months previously at Howard University. Dr. Essie Rutledge is a member of that fine organization, and 6 other members of Congress are also sharing that same sorority. Now my story. My ancestors, John and Pearlie Harris, were born enslaved people. John Harris was a horse jockey, and his owner told him that if he continued to win races, he can purchase his 6 children and his wife. And he did that. Fast forward to a few decades to John Harris's granddaughter, Rosie Lee McLemore, and her husband, Horace, my great-grandparents. In St. Francis County, for the sum of $1, according to the document, payment of a poll tax was authorized by the Act 220 of 1947. As far as I can tell, for nearly 10 years, my mama Rosie and Daddy Mac paid $1 poll tax up until 1960. I brought their 1960 poll tax with me. As you know, the Voters' Right Act was passed in 1965. So today I tell you that my mama Rosie was a grandmother and into her 50s, way before she was allowed to vote. And I have proof of that the daughter of an enslaved person tried to vote. Mama Rosie is the asterisk to the 100-year commemoration of this 19th Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammie Leigh. Our next speaker is Dr. Julia Albarricin, she's a professor of political science.
So I'm going to give you another perspective from a woman of color. I appreciate that Jane made an effort to account for the fact that not everybody benefited the same way from the 19th Amendment. So I want to offer an alternative voice, and I'm here to say that the fact that the 19th Amendment concluded a century-long battle for equality by guaranteeing the right to vote is a myth, right? And there are a couple of problems with this assertion. The first one is that organizing occurred much before Seneca Falls in 1948, and a lot of that organizing came from women of color. And the second one is that the struggle took several additional decades to guarantee the right to vote to all women independently of their color. When we're teaching this myth in our classroom, and I have done it before, we ignore that millions more remain shut out of the polls after ratification. Indeed, as middle-class white women celebrated ratification by parading through the streets, African-American women in the Jim Crow South who had worked for women's rights found themselves shut out of the ballot box for another half-century. As the historian Nancy Hewitt has shown, a lengthy campaign and a range of subsequent laws was required to fully open the ballot box to others, including Black women, Mexican-American women, Native American women, Chinese American, and Korean American women. Among those necessary laws were the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1943, which banned Chinese immigration to this country, the adoption of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which abolished racial restrictions to be naturalized in the United States, the 24th Amendment prohibiting poll taxes in 1964, and finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In other words, the 19th Amendment was one step in a long, racially tense battle for voting rights that seemed secure a few decades ago, but faced a grave threat today, as Jane mentioned. The white suffrage heroes got a lead on the historical record in 1881, and I'm referring to Stanton and Anthony, when they inaugurated the first volume of what would be called the History of Woman Suffrage. The duo and their cameras established an enduring legacy, and they designated Seneca Falls in 1848 as the starting point of the women's rights movement. In fact, the movement already was arousing in various forms and in various places. History of Women's Suffrage provides a detailed account of a movement that implicitly defined women as people who were white and middle class, and renders implicitly African American women, as well as Mexican American and other women, virtually invisible. For a long time, historians relied on this history and duplicated its omissions. The African American historian Rosalind Tabor Penn discredited this version of events by uncovering more than 100 black suffragists. In recent decades, historians have shown that black women were erased partly because they sensibly argued that gender discrimination and racism were interconnected problems that could not be neatly separated. Today, we call this intersectionality, and black suffragists were pioneers in arguing this. The 19th Amendment can fairly be seen as an important milestone in an unfinished fight for justice. It is morally wrong and counterproductive to mythologize it as a triumph of egalitarianism at a time where the voting rights are under attack in the courts and in state legislators all over the United States. Let's keep up the good fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Next, we have Sue Scott, who is the director of the Western Illinois Museum.
At the Roseville Opera House in 1856, Susan B. Anthony called to anyone in the audience in favor of women's suffrage to rise. The first person to rise was 8-year-old Emma Smith. Anthony responded, "A little child shall lead you." This experience instilled in Emma a lifelong interest in women's suffrage. I recently learned about Emma Smith. She was born in Roseville, and after attending Eureka College, she married Henry DeVoe. They moved to the Dakota Territories, where in the 1890s, she participated in successful suffrage campaigns. Susan B. Anthony was often a guest at the DeVoe house. She became a paid organizer for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, working to establish 28 chapters in 28 states. Like Anthony, she took what was known as a non-confrontational approach as to not alienate male legislatures. History has documented that this approach led to racist strategies against people of color. In 1910, she continued her work to help gain women the right to vote in Washington state. From Emma's story, I learned that history is messy. People can have the conviction to stand up for their beliefs while not being able to see clearly the consequences of their actions. As I study history, I realize that there are many sides to the story that need to be told. There's always more to learn. You know, we're all a work in progress, and we need to make an effort to gain an in-depth understanding. Now, Aunt Josie, she didn't shy away from difficult situations. Josie Westfall established the McDonough County Orphanage, where she was hired to take care of countless children. She filled that role for 27 years as caretaker. It was considered at the time a well-suited position for a woman. In 1914, she was the first woman to run for Macomb City Judge, a role not considered, at the time, appropriate for women. Josie Westfall, like most of us, was complex. She didn't fit into a single narrative that history often constructs. Like us, I cannot help to believe that she was not shaped by the news of the issues facing the country of her time, like the women's suffrage movement. I was really curious about her choice to run in the election of 1914, because a lot was happening at that time around women's rights. Did she know about that unprecedented and widely reported suffrage parade that took place in March of 1913 in Washington, D.C., with delegates from across the country, including Illinois? That same year, Josie surely knew about the passage of the Illinois Presidential and Municipal Voting Act that became part of a groundswell of support for the suffrage movement. That act allows women to vote for president and non-constitutional offices, anything that wasn't defined in the Constitution, like school board. In the state of Illinois, the first election women were allowed to vote was the year that Josie ran for city judge. As you can imagine, Josie's run for judge against a trained lawyer caused a stir. The Macomb Daily Journal, just days before the June 1st election, reported that questions had been raised about her qualifications to hold position of judge. She had no legal training. It was concluded by lawyers that the right to vote carries with it the right to hold office. And guess what? She won. She received 839 votes to Franklin's 577. Josie carried every ward in the city, although Franklin received 19 more male votes in the 4th ward. These numbers indicate that Josie was well respected. The suffrage movement often placed well-respected women who worked in social services, like Josie, at the forefront to push boundaries. The goal was to show that women had the capacity to play a role in government. And the suffrage movement took notice. The New York-based Independent, a weekly newspaper dedicated to women's suffrage, reported on July 6th of 1914 that Illinois women are eager for political activity and that is now open to them. And then the report went on to report in detail Josie's victory over Dean Franklin. Dean Franklin launches a series of lawsuits to unseat Josie. The case is finally decided by the Illinois Supreme Court. It's worth noting that she served 2 years before the decision was handed down in April of 1916, and it was in favor of Dean Franklin. They stated that the city judge is a constitutional office and women do not have a right to vote for this office. The women's votes would not be counted, and Franklin was declared the winner. He had just 19 more votes than Josie. Male votes. Was Josie Westfall an advocate for women's rights? I'm not sure. It's clear that she made choices that challenged the status quo. She put herself out there. She took action to affect the change, where she was and with what she had. While she did not win the election, she showed women and everyone else what is possible with equality and voting rights. It's a message for us today to vote and to work to ensure that everyone has the possibility to vote. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Gayle Carper. She is also a Macomb City Alderwoman.
Today we celebrate the 19th Amendment. It bears repeating that while the 19th Amendment gave all American women the constitutional right to vote in 1920, not all women could vote. Black women in the South had to put up with racist Jim Crow laws for another 45 years. Native Americans didn't have full access to voting until 1962 and were stopped from voting with poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation, the same tactics used against black voters. A long campaign and many laws were required to fully open ballot access to others, including another constitutional amendment, the 24th, and finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So as you've heard, the 19th Amendment was but one step in a long battle for the right to vote. It seemed secure a few decades ago, but it's under attack again today. For the 50 years between 1920 and 1970, elected women were a rarity. Let me mention just a few of the firsts. In 1924, Nellie Ross of Wyoming was elected the first woman governor in the United States. 1928, Minnie Buckingham Harper of West Virginia was the first black woman in a state legislature. In 1930, for the first time, New Mexico elected 2 Latina state legislators. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman elected to the U.S. House and the first to seek the nomination for President of the United States from one of the 2 major political parties. In 1992, the first woman of color elected to the Senate was Carol Moseley Braun of Illinois. It wasn't until 2012 that the first woman of color elected to both chambers in the federal government. Her name is Mazie Hirono of Hawaii. She was elected to the House in 2007 and the Senate in 2012. And in 2017, the first Latina woman, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, was elected. I have to mention a few of the elected women who inspired me. When I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, the most common way a woman held a national or state office was when her husband died and she was appointed to fill the remainder of his term. Except in 1948, Margaret Chase Smith became the first woman elected to the Senate without having been appointed. She was one of the first senators to denounce Joseph McCarthy. She also made a brief effort to become the Republican presidential candidate in 1964. As a teenager in 1964, I was in awe that she insisted on using both her birth name and her married name. In 1984, Geraldine Ferraro, teacher, lawyer, United States Representative from 1979 to 1985, and the first woman vice presidential nominee by a major political party. I was ecstatic. An Italian woman, just like my mother, my 7 aunts, and my immigrant grandmother. And my absolute favorite elected woman, Barbara Jordan. She was a lawyer, an educator, and a congresswoman from 1972 to 1978. She was the first African American congresswoman to come from the Deep South and the first woman ever elected to the Texas Senate in 1966. She became nationally known for her expertise on constitutional law during the Watergate hearings. She gave the keynote speeches at the Democratic National Convention in 1976 and in 1992. The numbers of women in elected state and federal offices stayed at around 3 to 6% throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. And then something happened in 1992. I'm not sure what, but I like to think that maybe women finally got tired of having men run the government. The numbers changed. Percentages of women in federal elected office jumped to 10%, in state elective office to 22%. And the percentage increased every year until now. Right now, in the U.S. Congress, there are 127 women, 23%. 26 women serve in the Senate and 101 in the House. The number of women of color elected to Congress reached an historic high of 43, and at least 3 women elected identify as LGBTQ. Women hold 28% of state executive offices, and the proportion of women in state legislatures is now 29%. In the 100 largest cities in the United States, 27 have women mayors. 7 are black women, and 2 are Asian Pacific Islander women. In the Illinois legislature, there are 44 women, or 29%, including the 2 that represent McDonough County. In the McDonough County Courthouse, 2 of our judges, 4 of our county board members are women, and the county assessor, circuit clerk, county clerk, and treasurer are all women. Based on my personal experience in the courthouse, McDonough County wouldn't be working without those women. And in Macomb, and in the city of Macomb, both the township assessor and supervisor and the city clerk and 3 of the 7 members of the city council are women, and that is 42%. But the fight for the vote is not over. Voter suppression rises as the number of voters rise. Voter suppression disproportionately affects people of color, young people, and people with disabilities. And messing with the post office will make it harder for everyone to vote. I'm asking, will you continue the fight so that all of us can vote freely and safely? I can't hear you, and if I can't hear you, they won't hear you in City Hall, in Springfield, or Washington. Will you continue the fight? Finally, just as the fight for the right to vote didn't end in 1920, the fight for equality isn't over. Women are 51% of the world's population, but the work of women is underpaid, overlooked, and often forgotten. I'm asking again, will you keep facing the storm, whatever it is? Will you all continue to write women into history? Thank you.
Thank you, Gayle, and thank you to all of you. We're going to get ready now to have our parade, and we're going to separate, I think, into two groups and march down the sidewalk in these direction and then towards the statue. We have two parade leaders. We have Brenda Allison and Carol Sims to lead the parade. Thank you all for coming.
We vote because we can. Why do we vote? We vote because we can. Mail in, walk in, get in and vote.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming.